Hello, this is Evelyn Hockstein, and I'm a photojournalist based in Washington, D.C. I took this photograph on assignment for the Washington Post, June 25th, 2020, in Lincoln Park, about 1 month after protests began following the death of George Floyd. I cover all kinds of assignments in my work. I photographed everything from war zones to the local elementary school. I was working on a COVID story about the national food supply. When I left the restaurant where I was photographing this burger, I saw the first DC protest organizing a few blocks down the road. George Floyd was killed on May 25th, 2020, in the hands of police in Minneapolis. The video of his violent death, as Mr. Floyd gasped for air and called for his mother for nearly 9 minutes under the knee of a white police officer, caused an outpouring of grief and outrage. Protesters took to the streets of Minneapolis the following day, and within days, protests had spread across the country. By May 28th, protests began in Washington, D.C., and continued daily. Until then, I had been quarantining and had only worked on assignments where I could maintain a safe social distance. I was nervous to enter such large crowds of people because of COVID. But I also couldn't walk away from the protesters. I felt this was too important a moment in history, so I did what I had to do. I started documenting these events. Police clashed with protesters nightly. One night, the Park Police and National Guard used pepper spray and horses to clear the area so President Trump could walk to the nearby St. John's Church and hold up a Bible for a photo op. Days later, the mayor of Washington, D.C., Muriel Bowser, created Black Lives Matter Plaza in the area where protests occurred near the White House. "2020 saw some of the biggest protests for civil rights and racial justice in the United States in decades. The protests swelled again in August following the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And again in September when a grand jury decided not to bring homicide charges against the police officers involved in the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor. The protests saw a renewed focus on controversial monuments, especially Confederate monuments, which have been the subject of nationwide debate. In 2017, I photographed white supremacists protesting the removal of the Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. Heather Heyer was killed that day when a white nationalist drove his car through a crowd of counter-protesters. This statue of Confederate General Albert Pike, which stood outside of Judiciary Square in Washington, D.C., was toppled by protesters late in the evening on Juneteenth. After the Pike statue came down in D.C., protesters took on the Emancipation Memorial. D.C. Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton announced plans to introduce legislation to remove the memorial. The monument has been criticized for its paternalistic character and for not doing justice to the role that African Americans played in their own liberation. While the monument was paid for by formerly enslaved people, a white artist conceived the original design. Frederick Douglass spoke at the dedication of the monument in 1876, but after giving the speech criticized the statue's design. Mr. Douglass thought the park should include more dignified monuments of free black people. Mr. Douglass said, "The Negro here, though rising, is still on his knees and nude. What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not couching on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man." I photographed this reenactor at the monument during the protests. I wasn't sure what to expect that night, but when I took this image, I knew it was the shot. I feel this image resonates with so many people because it is so layered. The emotion on their faces, to the body language and composition, tells one part of the story, but the story is far more complex. The confrontation between these two people illustrates what was happening in our country in that second. Their dynamic captures the tension of the present, the George Floyd protests, and the Black Lives Matter movement. It also incorporates the past into their confrontation, and the fate of the statue speaks to what the future may hold for the United States. This image is black versus white, history versus present, male versus female, old versus young at first glance. But then there's this void between these two people. Maybe if we can try to understand all of the dynamics represented in this photograph, the space between these two human beings could begin to close.